Welcome to Panda Talks Crime. Today we're diving deep into something a listener sent to us, a tragic event that happened back in the summer of 2000, the Amarnath Massacre. This one really shows how even just acts of faith can get caught up in violence. We're talking about a pilgrimage. A journey meant for peace and devotion, becoming the target of a brutal attack.
Yeah, and this particular pilgrimage, the Amarnath Yatra, it holds a lot of significance for Hindus. It's a journey to the Amarnath Cave high in the Himalayas. It's believed that Lord Shiva revealed the secrets of immortality there. Just imagine the devotion it takes to undertake such a journey, often through treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather.
You're really painting a vivid picture for our listeners. It sets the stage for just how serious this event was. So let's take them back to the early morning hours of August 1st, 2000. What was it like right before the attack happened?
Picture a large group of pilgrims making their way to the Amarnath Cave. Some are walking, some are in vehicles. All of them filled with this sense of anticipation and a spiritual purpose. It's important to remember, a lot of these pilgrims save up for years to make this journey. They travel from all over India to be there.
It's like a snapshot of peaceful devotion, totally unaware of the darkness that's about to come. So walk us through the attack. What exactly happened?
Out of nowhere, a group of militants ambushed the convoy. They just opened fire with no warning, just targeted the pilgrims. It didn't matter who it was. The sources we've looked at indicate that these militants were most likely from Lashkar-e-Taiba, a group with a history of violence, and a stated goal of separating Kashmir from India.
So they targeted this pilgrimage
Yeah.
as a way to make some kind of statement. What were they hoping to achieve by attacking these pilgrims?
That's a complicated question. On the surface, it seems like an act of terror, meant to cause as many casualties as possible and just spread fear. But by targeting something like the Amarnath Yatra, a symbol of Hindu faith, Lashkar-e-Taiba was also trying to inflame religious tensions and undermine India's authority in the region. Don't forget, Jammu and Kashmir has been a disputed territory for decades, with all kinds of groups fighting for control.
So this attack wasn't just about violence. It was connected to the complex politics of the region. It's chilling to think about how these pilgrims got caught in the middle of this larger conflict.
Exactly. And it's important for our listeners to understand this attack was brutal and fast. 30 people died, women and children included. Dozens more injured. These weren't soldiers or politicians. They were just ordinary people on a spiritual journey, totally caught off guard.
It's heartbreaking. I can't even imagine the chaos and terror.
Huh.
Can you describe the scene a little more for the listeners?
Imagine the sound of gunfire shattering the morning, people scattering, desperately trying to find cover or escape the bullets. The attackers pursued the fleeing pilgrims, showed no mercy, and that mountainous terrain, which just moments ago was full of awe and spiritual connection, suddenly became a death trap. The pilgrims had nowhere to hide.
It really emphasizes how vulnerable they were and how calculated this attack was.
And the militants didn't just vanish after the attack. They retreated into the forest nearby, which led to a standoff with the Indian Army and police, who got to the scene pretty quickly.
So even after the attack, the situation was still dangerous. What can you tell us about that standoff and the aftermath of the massacre?
The aftermath was chaotic and tense. You had this huge manhunt happening. The Indian Army was trying to track down the militants. This event really forced India to rethink their entire approach to security in the region, especially when it came to protecting the Amarnath Yatra.
So even amidst all the grief and outrage, there was this immediate need to address security. What kind of things did they put in place?
They really ramped up security for all future pilgrimages. There were way more troops along the route. They set up checkpoints at regular intervals and really stepped up surveillance. This wasn't just temporary either. These changes became permanent for the Amarnath Yatra.
It's interesting how this one event totally changed the landscape of the pilgrimage. It went from being this relatively open and accessible journey to something that needs a heavy security presence.
And that brings up a really important point for our listeners. How do you balance the right to religious freedom with the need for security, especially in a place as volatile as Jammu and Kashmir?
It's a tough question. On one hand, people should be able to practice their faith and go on pilgrimages without being afraid. But on the other hand, the threat of violence is real, and the government has to protect its citizens.
Exactly. And there isn't an easy answer. Some people might say the increased security is absolutely necessary to prevent more attacks and keep the pilgrims safe. Others might argue that it goes against the spirit of the pilgrimage, and it turns it into something that feels more like a military operation than a spiritual journey.
It makes you wonder about the long-term impact on the pilgrims themselves. Something like that would leave emotional scars.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources talk about survivors returning home completely changed by what happened. Many of them suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by the memories of that day. The gunfire, the sight of people being killed or injured, the sheer terror of it all, it left a permanent mark.
It's hard to imagine how deep that trauma must be. And it's not just the survivors themselves. This must have had a ripple effect throughout the entire Hindu community.
It did. The Amarnath massacre became this symbol of vulnerability, this reminder that even sacred places weren't safe from the violence plaguing the region. It really shook the community's sense of safety and sparked this wave of anger and fear. It wasn't just an attack on these pilgrims. It was an attack on their faith, their identity.
And I imagine it fueled existing tensions between different religious groups.
For sure. By targeting a Hindu pilgrimage, Lashkar-e-Taiba was intentionally trying to provoke more violence and make the divisions in Kashmiri society even worse.
So the attack had consequences that went way beyond the immediate victims, impacting the social and political landscape of the entire region. It's a reminder that violence has a domino effect, with repercussions far beyond the initial act.
And it highlights just how difficult it is to achieve peace in a place like Jammu and Kashmir. Even if you take care of the immediate security concerns, all the underlying tensions and grievances are still there. This attack was just a symptom of a much deeper conflict, one that's been going on for decades.
It's a reminder that true security isn't just about military presence and checkpoints. You have to address the root causes of the conflict, encourage dialogue between communities, and find a way to live together peacefully.
Exactly. It's a huge task. But it's important for our listeners to know that despite the tragedy of the Amarnath massacre, there have been efforts to promote dialogue between faiths and build bridges between communities in Kashmir. It's a slow and often difficult process, but it's necessary if we want to break the cycle of violence.
It's encouraging to hear that even after something so horrific, there are people working to promote understanding and reconciliation. It gives a glimmer of hope that maybe someday, pilgrimages like the Amarnath Yatra can truly go back to being journeys of peace and spiritual enlightenment.
That's a powerful thought, and it brings us back to the human cost of this tragedy. It's easy to get caught up in the politics and strategy, but it's so important to remember the people behind the headlines, behind the statistics. Real people whose lives were shattered that day.
Their stories are what really bring this tragedy to life. It reminds us that we're not just talking about numbers or political agendas, we're talking about individual lives that were changed forever.
One survivor talked about losing her husband in the attack. He was walking ahead of her when the shooting started. She described this feeling of complete disbelief as she watched him fall. The world just turned into a nightmare. Another survivor, a young man who was injured, talked about the physical pain and emotional scars that still haunt him. He still gets scared when he hears loud noises. He's constantly anxious in crowds.
It's these personal accounts that make the tragedy real. It reminds us that we're not just talking about numbers or politics. We're talking about the lives of people who were irrevocably changed by this event.
And it shows the lasting impact of trauma. These survivors carry that experience with them every single day. It affects their relationships, their jobs, their sense of self.
It makes you realize that the true cost of violence goes way beyond the immediate casualties. It ripples outward, touching families, communities, entire societies.
It's a ripple effect that can last for generations. The trauma of the Amarnath massacre will continue to shape the lives of the survivors and their families for years to come.
It's a heavy thought, but an important one to think about as we try to understand this tragedy and what it means.
And it's a reminder that peace building isn't just about political negotiations and ceasefires. It's also about healing, about supporting survivors, about addressing the deep trauma that violence causes.
It's multifaceted, requires empathy, understanding, and a long-term commitment to creating a more just and peaceful world.
Exactly, and it's something that everyone needs to be a part of, from government leaders and policymakers to everyday people. We all have a role to play in preventing future tragedies and building a world where pilgrimages like the Amarnath Yatra can happen without fear.
It's a powerful message, especially after everything we've discussed today. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Amarnath massacre, what are some key takeaways for our listeners to consider?
It's a reminder that we can't just focus on the politics and the military stuff. We have to remember the human stories. You know, the people whose lives are changed forever by these things.
Yeah, and it brings us back to something we talked about earlier. Can faith and violence really coexist?
Yeah.
I mean, the Amarnath Yatra, this ancient pilgrimage all about devotion and spiritual seeking, now it has to exist in a place marked by conflict.
Right, and there are no easy answers, but maybe by understanding the history, by acknowledging the pain and the loss, and by talking openly and honestly, maybe we can start to find a way forward.
I think that's a really important point. It's not about ignoring the tough stuff or pretending everything's fine. It's about facing those challenges head on,
Yeah.
with a commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone involved.
Exactly. And for our listeners, it's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always hope. There's compassion. There's the belief that things can get better. The Amarnath massacre, it was a horrible tragedy, but maybe it can also be a push for change, for a deeper understanding of what causes conflict and why peace is so important.
It's a call to action for all of us to stay informed, to have those tough conversations, to challenge prejudice and intolerance wherever we see it.
And to remember that peace isn't just about the absence of war. It's about justice. It's about understanding. It's about empathy. It's something we have to work at. It takes effort, commitment, and a willingness to listen to people who are different from us.
Well said. It's been a really insightful deep dive into such a complex and tragic event. Thank you for taking us through this, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey.
And if you found this conversation interesting, we encourage you to subscribe to Panda Talks Crime for more deep dives into some of the world's most intriguing and challenging topics.